The most dangerous secrets are never announced. They reveal themselves in a single sentence. Every conversation inside Hanseong House had stopped long before the first course was served, because when the father of one of the most powerful Korean crime families accepted an invitation, silence became part of the dress code. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm chandeliers, polished walnut walls reflected the amber glow of candlelight, and every guest understood that respect was measured long before a word was spoken. At precisely 7 o'clock, the private dining room doors opened, and a young black waitress stepped inside carrying a silver tray with practiced confidence. Her name was Vanessa Carter, 28 years old, working double shifts 6 days a week just to keep her small apartment in Chicago and help cover her grandmother's medical bills. To everyone else, she was invisible. Another employee trained to smile politely, refill glasses quietly, and disappear before anyone remembered her face. She had mastered that role long ago because invisible people survived difficult places. She approached the head of the table, where an elderly Korean gentleman sat beside his son, Daniel Kong, a respected businessman to outsiders and a man surrounded by whispered legends to everyone else. Daniel barely glanced at her as he reviewed a message on his phone while executives, investors, and family friends continued discussing contracts worth millions of dollars. Vanessa stopped exactly where etiquette required, lowered her eyes with calm composure, and bowed with effortless precision. Then she spoke. The words were not standard Korean. They were not the polished phrases taught in universities or language apps. Instead, they flowed gently in an old regional dialect spoken decades earlier in a small fishing community outside Busan, carrying subtle expressions that even many younger Koreans no longer recognized. It has been a long journey home, elder. May peace arrive before your footsteps do. The silverware stopped moving. A wine glass remained suspended halfway to someone's lips. Even the pianist outside the room seemed to vanish beneath the weight of the silence. The elderly man slowly lifted his eyes toward her, the calm expression on his weathered face replaced by unmistakable disbelief. Daniel finally looked up from his phone, confused by the sudden stillness spreading across the room like winter frost. His father studied Vanessa for several long seconds before answering in the exact same dialect, his voice soft, cautious, almost searching. It was the kind of greeting reserved for people who belonged, not visitors, not tourists, not strangers. Vanessa answered without hesitation. Her pronunciation carried the rhythm of someone who had learned the language through daily life rather than classrooms, every vowel shaped by memory instead of rehearsal. Around the table, puzzled glances turned into uneasy curiosity. One executive frowned. Another quietly whispered that she must have memorized a few old phrases to impress wealthy customers. Daniel remained silent, but his attention never left her face. Something about her calm eyes suggested she had expected this conversation all along. The elderly man leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer guarded but deeply personal, as though a forgotten chapter of his life had suddenly walked into the room wearing a simple black waitress uniform. No one noticed that the food had begun growing cold. No one reached for another drink. Because in that extraordinary moment, every person in the room realized the young woman they had overlooked less than a minute earlier had somehow spoken directly to a past that none of them even knew still existed. The elderly gentleman did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied Vanessa with the careful patience of someone searching through decades of memories that had almost disappeared. His eyes, gentle but impossibly observant, lingered on her face, as though he expected recognition from a person he had never met. Around the table, expensive watches continued ticking, but no one dared interrupt the silence. Finally, he spoke again in the same forgotten dialect, this time asking a question so specific that several younger relatives exchanged confused glances. He asked whether the old stone bridge near the eastern harbor still echoed with fishermen singing before sunrise during the autumn squid season. Vanessa lowered her eyes respectfully before answering in the identical dialect. She explained that the songs had nearly disappeared because the younger generation had moved to larger cities, but every October a handful of elderly fishermen still gathered before dawn, carrying handmade lanterns and singing the same melodies their fathers had once taught them. The old man's breathing slowed. His fingers tightened gently around the porcelain teacup resting before him. Daniel watched his father more closely, then he watched the waitress. He had never seen that expression before. It was not surprise alone. It was longing. One executive finally cleared his throat with an awkward smile. He laughed softly and suggested that modern language applications could teach almost anything these days. Another guest nodded with visible relief, eager to explain away this strange moment with logic. Someone else remarked that restaurants often trained employees to memorize greetings from different cultures to impress wealthy clients. Vanessa simply remained still, neither defending herself nor correcting anyone. Years of working in hospitality had taught her that explanations rarely changed assumptions. The elderly gentleman ignored every comment around him. Instead, he asked another question. This one reached even deeper into the past. He mentioned a tiny hillside temple that had never appeared in travel guides, a place where village children once gathered each spring to tie colorful ribbons to an ancient pine tree while grandparents prepared sweet rice cakes by hand. Daniel frowned. Even he had never heard that story before. Vanessa answered almost immediately. She described the temple bell that rang every evening just before sunset, the cracked stone steps leading to the courtyard, and the old woman who always insisted every child leave with one extra rice cake for the walk home. She even repeated a gentle proverb that the woman had spoken to every visitor, saying that kindness always arrived quietly, just like the first snowfall. The elderly gentleman slowly closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was unmistakable moisture gathering beneath them. He whispered the final words of the proverb before Vanessa could finish them, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, a genuine smile appeared across his face. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his curiosity replacing every business concern that had occupied him only minutes earlier. This could not be rehearsed. No language course could teach memories that had never been written down. No employee handbook could explain traditions forgotten by entire generations. Vanessa was not performing. She was remembering. Yet the greatest mystery remained unanswered. How could a young black woman from Chicago carry pieces of a Korean village inside her heart with greater care than many people born into that very culture? And as every guest searched for an explanation, Vanessa quietly reached for the teapot, calmly refilling the elderly gentleman's cup as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The room slowly exhaled, but the uneasiness refused to disappear. Conversations that had once flowed effortlessly now stumbled over uncertain pauses as every guest kept stealing glances toward Vanessa. She continued serving each course with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed since the beginning of her shift, never lingering longer than necessary, never inviting attention. Yet attention followed her anyway. One of the younger executives finally leaned back in his chair with a confident smile that carried just enough arrogance to fill the silence. He insisted there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps she had studied Korean linguistics in college. Perhaps she had worked abroad. Perhaps she had memorized stories from documentaries or books. After all, anyone with enough determination could imitate culture. Several guests nodded with visible relief. The explanation sounded reasonable, and reasonable answers felt much safer than mysteries. The elderly gentleman gently placed his teacup onto the table. His expression remained calm, but his eyes suggested he had already reached a different conclusion. Before he could speak, the executive turned toward Vanessa with polite confidence and asked whether she would mind answering a few questions purely out of curiosity. She paused for only a moment before offering a respectful nod. There was no fear in her posture, only patience. The executive smiled as though he were about to settle the matter once and for all. Switching entirely into Korean, he abandoned standard speech and deliberately mixed unfamiliar expressions with regional vocabulary collected from several provinces. Even fluent speakers often struggled to untangle sentences constructed that way. Vanessa listened carefully, without interrupting. When he finished, she smiled gently before replying in clear Korean. She did not embarrass him. She simply explained that he had accidentally blended expressions from different regions that local grandparents would never use together because each belonged to families separated by hundreds of miles. She even offered the more natural version of the sentence, preserving the warmth and rhythm that elderly villagers preferred. The executive blinked several times before quietly lowering his eyes. Another guest leaned forward with growing curiosity. This time she asked about an old harvest celebration that had disappeared decades earlier. Vanessa answered by describing children carrying woven baskets filled with fresh pears while elders tied ribbons around their wrists to symbolize gratitude for another season together. She described the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting through narrow streets and neighbors leaving bowls of homemade soup outside their doors for anyone who arrived hungry. Every detail sounded less like research and more like memory. Daniel watched the exchange in complete silence. He had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without losing his composure, yet he now found himself studying a waitress whose greatest possession appeared to be quiet confidence. She never rushed. She never tried to impress anyone. She answered only what she was asked, then returned to serving the table as though nothing unusual had happened. That humility unsettled him more than any dramatic performance ever could. His father finally spoke again, asking a question that caused every Korean guest to lift their heads at once. He quietly recited the first half of an old lullaby that had almost disappeared from public memory, then stopped before the final verse. Without hesitation, Vanessa completed the song in the same gentle melody, her voice soft enough to resemble a distant memory rather than a performance. The final words lingered in the air long after she had fallen silent. The elderly gentleman lowered his head, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and smiled with unmistakable gratitude. Daniel realized that whatever truth stood before him had nothing to do with language alone. It belonged to a chapter of his father's life that even his own family had never been invited to read. The elderly gentleman rested both hands around his teacup, saying nothing more, yet his silence carried greater weight than any speech could have offered. Around the table, curiosity slowly transformed into something deeper. The guests were no longer trying to decide whether Vanessa spoke Korean well. They were trying to understand how someone they had dismissed as ordinary could carry memories that belonged to another generation. Daniel noticed the shift before anyone else did. Every eye followed her movements now, not because she demanded attention, but because she never once appeared aware that she had earned it. She quietly replaced empty dishes, refreshed water glasses, and thanked each guest with the same calm smile she had offered when she first entered the room. There was no pride in her expression, no expectation of praise. That quiet humility unsettled Daniel more than confidence ever could. One distinguished investor, a man known for questioning everything, finally leaned forward with folded hands. He apologized politely before asking Vanessa one final question. If she truly knew the old village so well, could she explain a tradition that almost nobody outside a handful of families would recognize? Vanessa nodded respectfully. The man described an old custom involving folded white cloth placed outside certain homes during the first snowfall. Several Korean guests looked puzzled. Even they had never heard of it. Vanessa smiled softly before answering. She explained that the cloth was never meant to decorate the doorway. It quietly signaled that an elderly neighbor living alone should receive food before nightfall because heavy snow often prevented travel through the narrow mountain roads. Families who noticed the cloth would leave warm soup, fresh rice, or homemade side dishes without knocking so that no one would feel embarrassed accepting help. The room became perfectly still once again. The investor slowly lowered his gaze. That tradition had belonged to his late grandmother's village. He had mentioned it only because he believed no outsider could possibly know its meaning. Before anyone recovered, the elderly gentleman asked another question, this one carrying a hint of emotion beneath its calm tone. He asked what villagers traditionally said before placing food at the neighbor's door. Vanessa answered immediately. She repeated the simple blessing in the same gentle dialect, wishing warmth inside the home before the winter wind reached the windows. The elderly gentleman quietly whispered the final words together with her. Daniel watched his father's hands tremble almost imperceptibly around the porcelain cup. It was the first visible sign of emotion he had witnessed in years. One guest could no longer contain his curiosity. He asked Vanessa where she had learned all of this. She paused briefly before offering the same respectful smile she had worn throughout the evening. I learned by listening, she replied. Elderly people always shared the most beautiful stories with anyone willing to slow down and hear them. There was nothing dramatic about the answer. Yet somehow it silenced every attempt to explain her away. Daniel realized that everyone at the table had assumed knowledge came from prestigious schools, expensive tutors, or impressive careers. Vanessa had quietly reminded them that wisdom often came from patience, kindness, and genuine respect for people whose voices the modern world had forgotten. His father looked toward Daniel with an expression that carried quiet disappointment rather than criticism. Without speaking a single word, the older man's eyes seemed to ask how many remarkable people had walked past them unnoticed simply because they wore ordinary uniforms. Daniel followed Vanessa with his eyes as she disappeared through the dining room doors carrying an empty serving tray. For reasons he could not explain, the room suddenly felt much quieter after she was gone, as though someone had taken an important piece of the evening away without anyone realizing it until that exact moment. Vanessa had barely reached the service station before she felt someone approaching behind her. She turned and found the restaurant manager standing there with an expression she had never seen before. He lowered his voice and informed her that the elderly guest wished to speak with her privately after dinner, if she was comfortable doing so. There was no pressure in his tone, only sincere respect. Vanessa thanked him quietly and returned to arranging fresh dessert plates, although her thoughts drifted somewhere far beyond the polished kitchen. She had spent years avoiding conversations about her past because every explanation seemed to create more questions than answers. She preferred serving meals over telling stories. They were much simpler. Back inside the private dining room, Daniel remained unusually quiet while his father stared out the large windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The older man eventually smiled to himself before speaking softly. He said that the young waitress reminded him of someone he had not thought about in more than 30 years. Every guest listened carefully. Daniel asked who that person had been. His father answered with a gentle laugh that carried equal parts gratitude and nostalgia. He explained that when he was 19 years old, his family had almost nothing. Their village had been struggling through difficult years, and many families depended upon one another simply to make it through another winter. One spring afternoon, an American missionary couple arrived with their young daughter. They did not come carrying wealth or promises. They came carrying books, medicine, warm blankets, and enough patience to earn the trust of people who had every reason to distress strangers. The little girl followed the village children everywhere. She learned their games before she learned their language. She copied the elders' accents so perfectly that everyone laughed each time she spoke. Instead of correcting her, the grandparents embraced her like another grandchild. She listened to stories for hours, memorized songs, joined seasonal festivals, and insisted on helping prepare meals even when she was too small to lift the cooking pots. The elderly gentleman smiled as though the memories had never truly left him. He admitted that everyone in the village believed the little girl would eventually forget them after returning to America. Life had a way of erasing childhood friendships. People moved forward. Languages faded. Traditions disappeared. Yet tonight, hearing that same forgotten dialect spoken with such natural warmth made him realize that at least one child had carried their village inside her heart all these years. Daniel slowly turned toward the kitchen doors, his expression changing with every sentence. Pieces that had seemed impossible only minutes earlier were quietly falling into place. The waitress had never been showing off. She had simply greeted an elder the only way she had learned to greet him as a child. At that same moment, Vanessa stood alone near the coffee station, carefully polishing a porcelain cup while memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit drifted gently through her mind. She could almost hear the temple bell echoing across the hillside at sunset. She remembered chasing butterflies through narrow village paths, sitting beside elderly women who corrected her pronunciation with patient smiles, and watching neighbors leave food outside one another's doors without expecting thanks. She had been too young to understand that those ordinary moments would one day become treasures impossible to replace. The kitchen lights reflected softly across the polished counter as she took a slow breath and returned the cup to its place. She still believed those memories belonged quietly in her heart. She had no idea that, just beyond the dining room doors, someone else had finally remembered them too. When dessert had been cleared and the last cups of tea were poured, the restaurant settled into the peaceful rhythm that followed an extraordinary evening. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room once again, conversations resumed in careful whispers, and the skyline beyond the windows shimmered beneath thousands of city lights. Yet one table remained unchanged. Daniel had barely touched his meal during the past 20 minutes. Instead, he found himself replaying every word Vanessa had spoken, every expression on his father's face, and every assumption he had quietly made the moment she first approached their table carrying a silver tray. For years he had believed that experience could teach him to read people within seconds. Tonight had proven how incomplete that confidence truly was. Across the table, his father finally placed his napkin beside his plate and looked directly at him. In a calm voice, he asked a simple question. "When she first greeted us, what did you notice?" Daniel answered honestly. He admitted that he had seen only a waitress performing her job. His father nodded slowly, without criticism. Then he asked another question. "And now, what do you see?" Daniel remained silent much longer this time. He realized that the answer had changed completely. He no longer saw an employee serving dinner. He saw someone who had quietly preserved memories, traditions, and respect that many successful people had allowed themselves to forget. His father smiled gently. "Status makes introductions easy," he said. "Character is what makes people unforgettable." Those words settled over the table, with quiet strength. None of the guests interrupted because every person present understood they were witnessing a lesson far more valuable than any business discussion planned for the evening. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager approached with respectful hesitation and informed Vanessa that the family wished to thank her personally before leaving if she had a few moments available after finishing her duties. Vanessa glanced toward the dining room before politely explaining that she would be honored to greet them once every guest had been fully served. Her answer surprised the manager. Most employees would have hurried immediately to meet such important customers. Vanessa simply smiled and continued helping another server carry fresh coffee to a nearby table. To her, every guest deserved the same attention regardless of reputation. Daniel happened to notice that decision through the open kitchen doorway. Once again, she had chosen responsibility over recognition. The observation lingered with him longer than he expected. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the final receipt was signed, and the last plates disappeared into the kitchen. Vanessa washed her hands, straightened her simple black uniform, and quietly walked toward the private dining room. There was no nervousness in her steps, only calm respect. She had no expectation beyond offering a polite farewell. When she reached the doorway, the room was almost empty. Most of the guests had already departed, leaving only Daniel and his father standing beside the large windows overlooking the city. The elderly gentleman turned as soon as she entered. His face brightened with the warm smile of someone welcoming an old friend rather than addressing a stranger. Daniel noticed something remarkable in that moment. Throughout the entire evening, powerful executives had stood when his father entered the room. Yet now, without hesitation or ceremony, his father rose once more, not because tradition required it, but because deep within his heart he believed the young woman standing before him deserved exactly the same measure of respect. Vanessa stepped into the quiet dining room and offered a respectful bow, expecting nothing more than a brief thank you before returning to finish her closing duties. Instead, the elderly gentleman took 2 slow steps toward her and looked into her eyes with the warmth of someone greeting family after many years apart. He spoke in the old dialect once again, asking whether she remembered the hillside where children raced homemade paper kites every spring after the first warm wind arrived. Vanessa smiled before answering softly that the kites almost always became tangled in the pine trees, and the village elders would pretend to complain while secretly helping every child retrieve them before sunset. The elderly man's smile grew wider. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. He gently asked her the question that had been waiting in his heart all evening. "Were your parents the American couple who stayed with Reverend Park?" Vanessa's eyes widened with quiet surprise. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in more than 20 years. Slowly, she nodded. She explained that her parents had volunteered in the village for several years while she was growing up. They believed that serving people meant living beside them rather than simply visiting. She attended the tiny local school, played with neighborhood children every afternoon, and spent countless evenings sitting beside grandparents who patiently corrected her Korean while feeding her homemade meals. When her parents eventually returned to the United States because of family responsibilities, she had been only 10 years old. She admitted that leaving the village had broken her heart. She had promised herself that she would never forget the people who had treated her like their own granddaughter. The elderly gentleman quietly laughed through eyes filled with emotion. He explained that everyone in the village had expected the little American girl to forget them after a few years. Time usually carried children toward new lives and new memories. Yet listening to Vanessa tonight had been like opening a window into a season of his youth that he believed had disappeared forever. Daniel remained silent, watching two people from completely different worlds speak as though decades had never separated them. He suddenly understood why his father had seemed so deeply moved throughout the evening. This was not simply about language. It was about gratitude surviving the passage of time. The elderly gentleman reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a small, worn photograph protected inside a leather holder. The edges had faded with age, but the faces remained clear. A group of smiling villagers stood outside the tiny church beneath flowering trees. Several children laughed at the front of the picture while an American family stood among them. Vanessa accepted the photograph with both hands. The moment her eyes found the image, her breathing caught. She immediately recognized her younger self wearing a simple straw hat that one of the village grandmothers had woven for her during a harvest festival. She gently touched the photograph with trembling fingertips before looking back at the elderly gentleman. Neither of them spoke for several seconds because words suddenly felt too small for memories that had waited decades to be remembered. Daniel looked from the photograph to Vanessa and then back to his father. Every unanswered question from the evening had quietly found its place. The remarkable waitress standing before them had never been pretending to belong. She had belonged all along, and the village that had shaped her heart had unexpectedly returned to welcome her home through the eyes of one man who had never forgotten the little girl who listened more carefully than anyone else. Vanessa held the old photograph with both hands as though it were made of glass instead of faded paper. Every face inside the picture awakened another memory she had carefully protected for years. She recognized the elderly woman who always tucked extra rice cakes into her pockets before the walk home. She remembered the carpenter who carved small wooden birds for every child during the harvest festival. She even laughed softly when she noticed a tiny boy making a silly face behind the adults. The elderly gentleman followed her smile and chuckled. He quietly admitted that the mischievous little boy had been him. The room filled with gentle laughter, dissolving the last traces of formality that had separated them only an hour earlier. Daniel watched the exchange with growing admiration. He had attended countless business dinners where people competed to appear impressive. Tonight, the most meaningful conversation had begun because one waitress remembered the kindness of ordinary people. His father slowly accepted the photograph back and carefully returned it to the leather holder before looking at Vanessa with unmistakable gratitude. Then, without warning, he stepped back and offered her a deep, traditional bow. It was not the polite gesture exchanged between strangers. It was a bow reserved for profound respect. Vanessa's eyes widened immediately. She instinctively bowed in return, trying to stop him, but the elderly gentleman remained lowered for one quiet moment before standing again. Daniel felt every lesson his father had ever taught him settle into a single unforgettable image. Throughout his life, he had watched influential people receive that same gesture because of their achievements, their age, or their position. Tonight, his father offered it simply because someone had honored another culture with sincerity and love. No title had earned that respect. No wealth had purchased it. Character alone had inspired it. The restaurant manager, who had quietly approached to thank the family for their visit, stopped in his tracks after witnessing the exchange. Several employees nearby also fell silent, unsure why such an important guest would bow so deeply to one of their coworkers. None of them understood the entire story, but every one of them recognized genuine respect when they saw it. The elderly gentleman smiled warmly before speaking in English, so everyone present could understand. He said that many people spent their entire lives trying to preserve traditions, yet this young woman had carried the heart of a forgotten village across an ocean without asking for recognition. He thanked her for protecting memories that even some families had allowed to fade. Vanessa lowered her eyes, visibly humbled by his words. She quietly explained that she had never considered those memories extraordinary. The people in that village had loved her when she was a child who looked different from everyone else. Remembering them had never felt like a duty. It had simply felt like gratitude. Daniel noticed the complete absence of pride in her voice. She spoke about those years the same way someone might speak about beloved grandparents, with affection rather than accomplishment. In that instant, he realized the greatest surprise of the evening was not her remarkable knowledge or flawless dialect. It was the extraordinary humility that had quietly protected those memories for decades without expecting applause. As the family prepared to leave, the elderly gentleman gently placed his hand over his heart and offered one final smile. Vanessa returned the gesture naturally, exactly as one of the village grandmothers had taught her long ago. The movement was small, almost invisible, yet it carried the weight of an entire lifetime, reminding everyone in the room that the deepest connections are often built not by blood, status, or success, but by simple acts of kindness remembered long after the moment itself has passed. The night air felt cooler as the restaurant doors opened and the city lights stretched across the quiet streets of Chicago. Luxury sedans waited along the curb while staff members stood near the entrance, thanking guests for visiting. Vanessa remained just inside the doorway with the rest of the team, offering the same warm farewell she gave every customer at the end of every shift. She expected the evening to end like any other. Instead, Daniel slowed his steps before reaching the waiting car. For a long moment, he simply looked back at the young woman who had unknowingly changed the entire atmosphere of the night. Earlier, he had noticed only a waitress carrying silver trays through a crowded dining room. Now he saw someone who had preserved the kindness of strangers for nearly 2 decades without asking anyone to admire her for it. He walked back toward the entrance while his father waited beside the car with a peaceful smile. Daniel thanked Vanessa sincerely for the evening. She answered with quiet humility, explaining that she had only shared memories given to her by generous people and that those memories had never truly belonged to her alone. They belonged to everyone who had welcomed a little girl into their village and treated her as family. Daniel nodded slowly. He realized that the greatest lesson of the evening had not come from forgotten dialects or childhood stories. It came from the way Vanessa never tried to prove her worth. She simply lived it. Before stepping outside, the elderly gentleman reached into his coat once more and carefully removed a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to Vanessa with both hands. Inside was the name and address of the old village church, now restored by local families after many years. He smiled gently and said that every spring the villagers still gathered beneath the same pine tree where children once flew paper kites together. Some of the grandparents were gone now, but their children and grandchildren continued the tradition because they believed memories only survived when someone chose to carry them forward. Vanessa accepted the note with grateful hands, her eyes shining as she quietly promised that one day she would return, not because she felt obligated, but because a part of her heart had never truly left. The elderly gentleman placed his hand over his heart once more before entering the waiting car. Daniel followed, but before closing the door he looked back one final time. Vanessa had already returned to helping another employee stack chairs and wipe tables for closing. She had not paused to admire the expensive cars, nor had she spoken about what had happened inside. She simply went back to serving others with the same quiet dedication that had defined her long before anyone noticed her. As the cars disappeared into the glowing city streets, Daniel understood something his father had tried to teach him since childhood. The world often measured people by titles, wealth, influence, or appearance, but the people who changed lives rarely announced themselves. They carried respect into every conversation, gratitude into every memory, and kindness into every ordinary day until those simple choices became unforgettable. Inside the restaurant, Vanessa carefully folded the small note and placed it beside the faded family photograph she always carried in her wallet. Two pieces of paper, separated by decades, now rested together as quiet reminders that genuine love, sincere respect, and grateful hearts could travel farther than oceans and endure longer than time itself. And on that ordinary evening in Chicago, everyone who witnessed those quiet moments walked away remembering that true dignity is never defined by the uniform someone wears, but by the respect they choose to give when no one expects it.